Welcome to your friendly neighborhood historian, where we discuss just enough history to inform, intrigue, and entertain. I'm Bill Petro. The history of the Beatles, their arrival in America. On February 7th, 1964, the Beatles landed at JFK Airport in New York. The airport had been recently renamed by a mourning country in honor of John F. Kennedy, who had been assassinated just 77 days earlier. The airport was now full of 4,000 greeters. Not realizing why there was such a crowd, Paul McCartney wondered aloud, "Who is this for?" as the screaming fans rushed the gates to meet the Beatles. 2 days later, on Sunday night, they would appear for their first of 3 consecutive Sunday night appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show. First American record album. Meet the Beatles was the first record album I ever bought. A monochrome cover and a dozen monophonic songs opened with the clap-track augmented "I Want to Hold Your Hand," followed by "I Saw Her Standing There." Both were already massive hits as singles in the U.S. To get a glimpse of the cultural impact it had on America and the value of a recording claptrack, watch the Tom Hanks movie, That Thing You Do. On Sunday nights in the 60s, everyone watched The Ed Sullivan Show. My family watched it. 73 million other Americans watched this particular show on February 9th, 1964. I was glued to the TV set for what would become a cultural watershed moment in American history and one of the world's top-viewed television events of all time. 60% of American TVs were tuned to it. Over 45% of Americans saw it. Ed Sullivan introduced them with, "Tonight the whole country is waiting to hear England's Beatles." The Fab Four performed 5 songs on the live broadcast. In glorious black and white, the personality of the British band came shining through as their names were superimposed over them as the camera panned to each one. Paul McCartney winked and smiled at the camera. George Harrison was standing in the center, doing tight guitar licks. For John Lennon, whose microphone barely worked, the caption below his name said, "Sorry, girls, he's married." Davy Jones, who would later become a teen idol in The Monkees, sang on that same show as the Artful Dodger with the cast of the Broadway musical Oliver. But who remembers that? He said to himself, "This is it. I want a piece of that." There were 50,000 requests for the 700 seats at the Sullivan Show. Elvis Presley had previously been paid $50,000 for 3 appearances. The Beatles' manager, Brian Epstein, negotiated top billing for the Beatles and 3 shows for just $10,000. It was about exposure at that time, not money. Years later, Paul McCartney would go down in history as the most financially successful musician in history. By the way, a later British rocker would emerge named David Jones, but as the name was already taken, instead he called himself David Bowie. The Beatles at Carnegie Hall. 3 nights later, they would do 2 shows at Carnegie Hall. Ticket prices were $4, $4.50, and $5. On February 11th, they played in Washington, D.C.'s Coliseum, to an audience of 8,000. Beatlemania. It had already been going on in the U.S. In 1963, radio stations played the UK single, "I Want to Hold Your Hand," and the B-side, "I Saw Her Standing There." These were released on vinyl in the U.S. the day after Christmas and sold 250,000 copies within 3 days and 1 million copies within 10 days. Time magazine wrote, "They look like shaggy Peter Pans." The British invasion had begun. While the Beatles were amongst the first wave, and perhaps more parent acceptable than others, they were followed by the Kinks, Dusty Springfield, Peter and Gordon, the Animals, Petula Clark, Herman's Hermits, the Rolling Stones, the Dave Clark Five, Donovan, Lulu, and Gary and the Pacemakers. Their Mercy Beats style of music, focusing on Liverpool in 1962, was a significant impetus to this first wave. The second wave of the British invasion included The Who and the Hollies. This was all helped by British movies that had become popular in the U.S., with British actors like Julie Andrews in Mary Poppins, Audrey Hepburn in My Fair Lady, Michael Caine in Alfie, Peter O'Toole in Lawrence of Arabia, and of course, Sean Connery as James Bond. As Seth Godin said in his TED Talk entitled The Tribes We Lead, the Beatles did not invent teenagers, they merely decided to lead them. What's the generational impact of the Beatles? There was a rebellious tone to this style of music, this rock and roll, and the impact of the Beatles cannot be underestimated. My father, at that time, clearly illustrated the generation gap highlighted by the Beatles. He didn't get the Beatles, not recognizing their beautiful harmonization until another adult pointed it out to him. Everyone recognized that they influenced clothing and hairstyle, but they did more than that. Their mid-career music contained psychedelic themes like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and drug themes like A Day in the Life. It also included Eastern religion in Across the Universe and sitar music, Within You, Without You. These all became part of their later music. What was the American impact? A generation ago, popular musicians served as the voice of their generation. During the 60s, for example, millions of people hung on every word the Beatles said. They provided the musical score for The Summer of Love in 1967. They were our musical poets. That is not as true today of other artists. Are the Beatles still relevant? Paul McCartney plays in sold-out arenas. Several years ago, while I was on a speaking trip to Manchester, England, I took a day to make a pilgrimage to nearby Liverpool. And when I got there, I hopped on a bus called the Magical Mystery Tour. It took me to the Beatles' childhood homes, significant sites, and musical venues. They played the soundtrack of my life. Are the Beatles still relevant? In recent years, decades after they stopped making music together, the Beatles are still rocking it. On September 9th, 2009, think of number 9, number 9, number 9, Harmonix introduced their music-themed video game, The Beatles Rock Band, with digitally remastered music. The Cirque du Soleil show Love opened in Las Vegas in 2006, and it ran until July of 2024. The Beatles received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Recording Academy in 2014. The Beatles received the Lifetime Achievement Award at the Grammys in 2014. Peter Jackson of Lord of the Rings film fame directed and produced a 2021 documentary series called The Beatles, Get Back. It covers the making of the Beatles' 1970 album, Let It Be, which had the original working title of Get Back. In 2023, the Beatles had a number one hit again, this time with the song Now and Then, based on a track from John Lennon. It was enhanced by technology provided by Peter Jackson's Weta Labs to isolate the voice of John Lennon and add tracks previously recorded by George Harrison, along with contemporary tracks by Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr. Who was your favorite Beatle? Thank you for listening. I'm Bill Petro, your friendly neighborhood historian. You can find more details on this topic and others on my website at billpetro.com.